Anjan, as we're trying to develop aesthetic cognitivism into an intellectual field of real inquiry, question of experimental design should be at the forefront. And you, as a scientist who works in a lab in neuroscience, neurology, what are some of the methodologies that you recommend, or the way of thinking that should be inculcated into this development?
Often, the first step is knowing what the question is to ask. And part of that involves a kind of taxonomy, as you and I were talking earlier today, which is you sit around with a bunch of smart people and you say, what are the terms? What are the terms we wish to investigate? You have this kind of broad category of aesthetic cognitivism, but what is the experience that perhaps adds to enriches our understanding?
And so you start cutting it into smaller pieces.
You start cutting it into smaller pieces. Yeah. You say, is awe an important dimension?
Yeah, and remember you started by dividing into two big categories. One is our sort of projection into the art itself, and the second part was our internal feelings, as at least the first bifurcation.
At a first bifurcation, and even in that conversation, you pointed out that one of the terms, I think we had transference that came out of the conversation earlier in the day, which I had put in the domain of our experience of the art, but you suggested maybe that should be better placed in terms of a subjective response to it. So that's the kind of thing, I think, an example of a sort of work in progress, right? Here is this domain that's important, that hasn't been studied very much. How do we figure out the important dimensions to investigate? Before you can even design an experiment, you need to know what's the question we want to ask.
Okay, that's great. I mean, let's just review what were some of the terms that we had. We don't have to remember all of them, but in the first category, remember we had beauty and awe and transcendence.
Presence.
And that was the idea. And how about in ourselves?
And in ourselves, the idea might be there could be straightforward emotions like joy, but there might be more nuanced ones like humility or gratitude or generosity, right? So these are the kinds of, we hope that powerful aesthetic experiences induces some change in us, and a change in these kinds of, perhaps one might call them virtues, but what are they?
Okay, good. All right, so let's say we do that step. We had it, and we were sitting at the scientist table, and there was a philosopher table and an artist table, and they're coming up with their thing. And let's say that you come to some agreement that here are the terms. So now you, as a laboratory experimentalist, when you see some clarity in some of these terms, what is your next step from a research methodology point of view?
From a research methodology, we would want to know whether people in general have similar responses, right? So here we have a bunch of experts: art historians, theologians, philosophers, psychologists, right? But we want to know, do people also, people who are not domain experts, have similar responses? And if they do, and the example I've used a couple of times is a philosopher or a theologian might make a distinction between sublime and awe, but I'm not sure the average person on the street would have a sense of that. So we want to know what's common, what are the common things that people respond to. And then you start designing an experiment where I might ask a set of art historians to say, which artworks do you think really evoke awe, right? And you vary that parametrically, and then you have people experiencing that artwork in a scanner, and now you can model the awe experience, right? You can't do it all. You have to do this in a series of experiments.
And how do you do? What kind of control do you build into that? Could you do something where they have the paintings that they say represent awe, and paintings that represent beauty? Because you can have beauty without awe, maybe awe without beauty. It's a horrible thing that just gets your emotions up. You define it as awe, and then you have a control where you're just looking at some landscape.
Sure. So you bring up a point that there are different basic designs that one can use. One can be a contrast, so it can say a block design. So here are a set of paintings that we think induce awe. Here are a set of paintings maybe induce disgust, right?
Okay.
I mean,
That's a sharper distinction.
That's a sharper distinction, and you say, what's the difference? Another design approach might be where you vary something parametrically. You say, this is a little awe, a little more awe,
Okay.
real big
So
awe, right?
You make the art historians value it 1 to 10.
Right, and then we go out and see, do people actually, is that how people behaviorally respond to it? And then in the scanner, instead of contrasting one to the other, you look at where is there neural activity that varies with the degree of awe. So that's another kind of method one might use.
That sounds harder.
It is harder, and if you really, like, sort of the kind of the gold standard, at least one, there are many gold standards, but one would be if you take two constructs, let's say awe, and something else, let's say beauty, you were suggesting that those might be different. If you have a set where those are orthogonal to each other, and by orthogonal, it means that one doesn't predict the other, right? You can have those shown, and now you've got two constructs that you're looking at, right? So you've got two things that adds to the specificity of what you're looking at.